Like many of you here today, I spend a great deal of my time on college campuses. In fact, I say I have the best 3 jobs in the world. I write books, I read books, and I teach books. Over the years, I've noticed that young people come into my classroom with the kind of education I once had when I came to the United States. As some of you know, I was born and raised in Morocco. My parents didn't go to college, but they were both book lovers. One of my earliest memories is seeing my father on one end of the sofa, my mother on the other, each one with a book in their hands. So I think it was really natural that I started reading at a very young age, and I also started writing at a very young age. I knew that I wanted to be a writer. My parents praised my stories the way one might praise a child for a good magic trick, but they made it very, very clear that writing could not be a career. I had to do something sensible with my life. They begged me. And so I majored in English. I enrolled at Université Mohammed V in Rabat, and as part of my coursework, I had to take a class on U.S. history. The curriculum for this class covered things like the founding of the United States, the Revolutionary War, Manifest Destiny, the Civil Rights Movement, subjects that are covered in most AP US history courses. And a short while later, I moved to the United States to do a PhD in linguistics at the University of Southern California, just a couple of miles from here. I settled in and I started going to classes. My goal was to become a college professor. But life intervened. A couple of years into my PhD, I met an American, and yada, 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 we got married. And so I ended up getting a green card. And a few years later, I got a notice in the mail informing me that I was eligible to become a US citizen. This is a decision that I thought about long and hard, because for me, citizenship isn't just a status, it's also a commitment. I studied for the test. In those days, there were 100 questions, things like how many representatives are there in the House of Representatives, what are the 3 branches of government, et cetera. And finally, the day came. It was July 2000, when I was to be sworn in as a citizen. The ceremony was held at the Pomona Fairplex, the same place where the Los Angeles County Fair is held each year. I remember it was a hot day, and they gathered 3,000 of us in this huge hangar for the ceremony, for the swearing in. So I went into that building an immigrant, and I came out as a citizen. Shortly after, I applied for and received my US passport. I had a conference on computational linguistics in Hong Kong, so I made immediate use of it. And my husband decided to tag along so we could do some sightseeing. Coming back to LA, we finally got to go through the same line at immigration. And so I handed my passport to the Customs and Border Protection agent, and he leafed through it, and then he turned to my husband, and he said, "So, how many camels did you have to trade in for her?" What he was implying, I suppose, was that I was a sexual object to be traded between a father and a husband. And since I was simply an object not endowed with speech, this comment was addressed to my husband rather than to me. I didn't know what to say. I think I just stared at him. And then he laughed and stamped my passport and handed it back to me. That was my very first interaction with an agent of the state. And it was an early instruction for me about the difference between legal citizenship and what I call conditional citizenship, between having papers that say you're American and actually belonging in America. And that is the subject of my book, Conditional Citizens, which is the disconnect between American principles and practice, between myth and reality. Now, I've published 4 novels, most recently The Other Americans, but for the last 20 years, I've kept returning to the subject of citizenship in many of my essays. Not just on days when I'm pulled over for a supposedly random pat-down at the security checkpoint at LAX, but also in other aspects of life, like voting in elections, or applying for a home loan, or registering my child to school, or attending a protest, or criticizing the government publicly. I was taught that the country was founded on a call to freedom, that Americans threw out their oppressors and asserted their independence. I was taught that this was a nation of immigrants. I can't tell you how many movies I watched growing up where the establishing shot was the Statue of Liberty. But the call for freedom and independence wasn't intended for everyone. The Immigration and Naturalization Act of 1790 restricted U.S. citizenship to free white persons with certain rights, such as the right to vote, even further restricted to property-owning white males. In other words, what we really had at the founding of this country is one elite deciding to free themselves from foreign rule and giving themselves the tool to govern over everyone else. It took decades of struggle, some of it brutal and bloody, for this system of citizenship to change. So as you all know, black men accessed the vote with the 15th Amendment, then white women gained it with the 19th Amendment. Native Americans became citizens in 1924, but it really wasn't until 1964 and the passing of the Civil Rights Act that the most fundamental right of citizenship, which is the right to vote, was guaranteed for all. Likewise, the boundaries of Americanness, which seems so elastic in the nation of immigrants myth, are in fact extremely rigid. For most of US history, a slew of race-based immigration laws, like the Chinese Exclusion Act or the Johnson-Reed Act of 1924, prevented immigrants from outside Western Europe from immigrating or claiming US citizenship. And again, it wasn't until the Immigration Act of 1965 that race quotas were abolished. And now we're seeing new restrictions. I'm thinking here of the immigration bans that were passed under the previous administration, or the continuation of policies like Title 42 under the current administration. Again and again in this book, I return to the disconnect between ideal and reality, examples of which I often found in the most unexpected of places. So while I was researching the book, for example, I tried to find out how big the Pomona Fairplex was. That's the place where I was sworn in. 487 acres was the answer. But I also discovered that this site, the Pomona Fairplex, served as an assembly center for Japanese Americans during the Second World War. Beginning on May 9, 1942, Japanese Americans from across Southern California were to report to the Pomona Fairplex, where they were housed in barracks built by the Army Corps of Engineers and later transported to an internment center in Heart Mountain, Wyoming. In other words, they went into the Pomona Fairplex as citizens, and they came out as enemies. And this brings me to the central idea of this book, which is conditional citizenship. US citizenship is supposed to grant people a set of rights, liberties, and protections, like the right to vote, the right to a fair trial, the right to protest, the freedom of movement, the freedom of expression, the freedom of religion. Conditional citizens are those among us whose rights become expendable in moments of crisis in order to preserve white supremacy. Japanese internment is one example, but there are many others. From the late 18th to the late 19th century, the government signed treaties with indigenous tribes in which it agreed to keep to its borders. But these agreements were summarily broken whenever the government decided that it needed land for settlement or for resources. During the Great Depression, and with soaring unemployment, the government turned on Mexicans and Mexican Americans. As many as 1 million immigrants across southwestern states, including California, were put on buses and repatriated to Mexico. After 9/11, the NYPD set up a secret office with the sole purpose of spying on Muslims. They placed informants in mosques, in businesses. They gained entry into private homes. They went into schools like NYU and Columbia, all of this without warrant. During the COVID pandemic, we heard the former president denigrate Asians and Asian Americans, and we've seen a spike in hate crimes. And year in, year out, we get intolerably violent and viral videos of Black men and women being brutalized by the police during routine traffic encounters. So conditional citizenship really is a way to talk about the long shadow of the Immigration and Naturalization Act of 1790, which fundamentally set up an unequal citizenship system. Now, of course, there's been a lot of progress in 200 years, and we like to think that we have equal citizenship. But in almost every interaction that we have with our government, whether it is at the border, in a routine traffic stop, in a courtroom, we can see disparities. We can see them on a cultural level too. For example, who gets to write a book called Crippled America? Who gets to criticize the United States and go on primetime shows? And who gets told to go back to where you came from? You can be a member of Congress and still hear this. I've talked to young people at different campuses about this book, and one of the reactions I've gotten, particularly from those whose parents and grandparents immigrated to this country, is that they feel seen by it. They come up to me at book signings to say a few words or to take selfies, but they also want to ask questions. How can we make things better? What can we do? What can I do? And this is what the final chapter of the book is about. At 18 or 19, you want to change the world, and that is a wonderful thing. The world has only ever changed thanks to young people. I tell them that they have to find the one thing that they're good at and put those skills in the service and use those skills in the service of a cause that they believe in. My great hope is that their reading of this book will connect them to others who share the same desire to make this country a better place. Thank you.